I'm not very prepared today because I'm not feeling very well, but I just wanted to share a little bit about Annie's story. My mom's not here, but hopefully she can watch it. Annie, who was in the nursery this morning, is 8 months old yesterday, and she's the answer to several year-long prayer that was in my heart, but also that Lucy prayed. She wanted a baby sister about the time that Silas was 7 months old. She brought me a book that we were looking at of a polar bear who ended up having twins. And we had read that book when I was pregnant with Silas, and she was super puzzled, and she brought me the book, and she was like, hey, the polar bear got twins, and I just got Silas. So I really need a baby sister. And so she was only like maybe 3, and she started praying. You know, she wanted a baby sister. She wanted twins, but her daddy prayed adamantly against that. So he was like, no. So she started praying, and it just wasn't the right timing. And then in the Lord's timing, which took a lot of patience, we found out we were expecting again. And so I would, tell Lucy, no matter what it is, because it wasn't twins, it's what Jesus wants us to have. If it's a boy, then that's his perfect plan for our life, and you'll have 2 brothers. You're already great sister to 2 brothers, to a brother. And so in the ultrasound that day, we took the children, and it was a little girl. And so Lucy was excited. You couldn't tell outwardly, but inwardly, Lucy was really excited. Silas didn't understand, and I was very excited, and Rich was excited. So I had a really hard pregnancy with Annie. I really struggled with, I just didn't feel right the whole time. And in the end, I ended up having hypertension, which is the step before preeclampsia. And so I was just really struggling. I didn't come to church those last couple of weeks because I just would lay on the bed at home. I was just really struggling. But every indication with Annie was that she was fine. They weren't concerned about Annie. They didn't think there was anything wrong with Annie. She was healthy. She was big. She moved constantly. She does now. And so they were just really concerned about me. And so I went into that doctor's visit, and I had actually been hospitalized once before because I was already pretty far along. I just couldn't progress any farther because I wasn't where I was supposed to be, and the Lord knew that. And so at about 38 weeks, a little over 38 weeks, they went ahead and decided they were going to induce me so that Annie could come on. And so we were so very excited because we had prayed for her for such a long time. She was such an answer to the Lord's promise. And but I was also very fearful, just because of the way I felt. And I had been fearful that whole pregnancy, just that I guess that I already had 2 healthy children. And so maybe I didn't deserve a 3rd healthy child. I felt like I was already so blessed that maybe that wasn't, it was not fair, really, because there were lots of people that can't even have children. And so I struggled with that my whole pregnancy, in addition to not feeling well and just being really fearful. And I prayed every day since before we even conceived Annie that she would not go to the NICU. That was my very specific prayer. Several of my friends prayed the same thing. I said, Lord, let her be healthy and whole and complete, and do not let her go to the NICU. And so when Annie was born, right after I had her, they laid her up on my chest, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. She looked like she had been sucker punched in the face. She was good, birth weight, but she just looked addled. And so the nurse immediately said, Doctor, I need you to cut the cord right now. I need to take her. And that was terrifying, and so they take her over, and her first couple scores were really low on this thing they grade them on called APGAR. And then it got better, and they were like, okay, I think she's okay. And they let me hold her, and I held her about 10 minutes. They were hoping she would kind of calm down. And she never calmed down. And so they took her after about 10 minutes. And the kids got to come in and see her. But they were disappointed that they weren't going to get to hold her. And so they took her to the back, and they put her on oxygen. And we didn't see Annie again. And the pediatrician came in, and he said, and Uncle Mike and Aunt Karen were there with us at that time, and he said, we're going to need to send her to the NICU. I'm not sure exactly what's going on. She's got a little bit of fluid in her lungs, but I think she's going to be okay. I think she just needs a little extra oxygen. We're just going to send her on just to be safe. He was the youngest pediatrician on staff. So it wasn't that he had all the knowledge. He was very knowledgeable. It wasn't that he was a senior doctor. He was just making a judgment call, basically. But the Lord knew that Annie needed to be at nice longer. And so they brought her in this little isolette, and I had held her for 10 minutes. And they said, we're sorry, we know this is really hard. We need you to sign these papers saying that we can take her. And so I signed the papers, and I held her little hand, and she went on to the NICU, and I just laid on the bed, and I cried because what God was doing is that he was saying to all of those prayers, please don't let Annie go to the NICU. He was saying, no, she's going to the NICU. He was telling me no, that he was not going to answer what I asked because he is God and I am not. And so I have had to decide, are you still good? Are you still good to me? And are you still good at being God? Something that we learned in Bible study, I think, with Lisa Turkhurst. And so they took her on, and we went up there. They discharged me like 6 hours after having a baby. They were confident that I was okay, but they were not excited that I was leaving. They could have just given me a pass, but they knew I really wanted to be with her. And so Rich and I walked all the way up to the NICU. I just wanted to be with my baby. We stayed till about midnight that night and kind of started building a reputation with the nurses. And, we got a nurse that she was with her every night. And so we kind of started feeling confident with her. She was Annie's angel at the NICU. And on the second night, we got a call at midnight. And it was a doctor that I've never met. And he said, Mrs. Crain, I just wanted you to know that we didn't have time to call you because there was an emergency and Annie's right lung collapsed. And we had to intubate her and reinflate the lung. And, first of all, we're exhausted anyway. And to have somebody you don't even know call you at midnight and say, your baby's right lung collapsed. She's 3 days old. And so we were like, what do we do? What do we do? And he was like, she's stable. I just need you to just trust the nurses. We'll call you if something's wrong. So I hung up the phone and, relaying this to Rich. And I'm like, what are we going to do? And he said, we're just going to start praying for her because that's really all we can do. Also he knowing that I've just had a baby 2 days before. And so we start praying. Well, the phone rings a second time. And I'm terrified, and I answer it, and it's her nurse. And her nurse is under no obligation to call me. But because we built a relationship with her, she wanted to call me. And she said, I know that you're really afraid right now. But she said, I want to tell you what I saw when Annie's lung collapsed because it was a miracle. Basically, she said, Annie was hooked up to all the monitors, and I was working with my second baby. They have 2 babies per nurse in the critical care unit. And she said, I turned around and just looked at her. Her monitors weren't going off, nothing. She said, and I could just tell that one half of her chest was sunken in. And I immediately called the doctor, and he immediately just looked at her and said, her lung has collapsed. We need to intubate her. She said Annie was breathing on her own without the assistance of any oxygen, all by herself with one lung. And she said, it was a miracle. And I said, no, Jesus was breathing for Annie. He was breathing for her. And so then they got her stable. Her lung healed in like a day. It was incredible. They took an x-ray that morning. They were like, there's still a little bit of a hole. They took an x-ray that afternoon. They were like, the hole is completely gone. And so she healed very quickly, but she continued to do what they called tummy breathing. She was working very, very hard for some reason. And again, she was the biggest baby. Like they would walk by and be like, there's that big baby. We don't know why she's here. But God knew why she was there. And so she remained stable, no improvement except for the healing of the lung, remained stable through the 4th day. And on the 4th night, I called in like I did every night because I woke up to pump, and so that she would have food whenever she could finally eat. And they called and said, I called in and I said, how's she doing? And it was the same nurse that had been with her when her lung collapsed. And she said, well, she's not done exactly what I wanted tonight. She's not been a very good girl. She's held her breath on me a couple times. That's the way she put it. Because they're very skilled and very trained in not making you alarmed, basically is what we learned. But what actually happened was that 3 different times in that night, Annie stopped breathing for over a minute, completely stopped. And they bagged her and could not get the airway open and had to wait until whatever was happening would stop and then restabilize her. And so when we walked in, so that was all I knew, is that she'd held her breath a couple times. To me, I imagined a little kid holding their breath. That's not what happened. But the Lord was protecting my heart during that time. And so we walked in on the 5th morning. I had called in. She was still stable. That was the word that they always use. She's stable. And knocked on the door, called in, and they said, they're working in that unit right now. It could have been on any baby. Let me find out what's going on. And the nurse came out then, and they don't usually do that. And she said, the doctor's working on Annie right now. He's putting her on a ventilator, so he would like for you to remain in the hall. And, we were just, it was like somebody had slapped us in the face. Again, I had prayed that she would not even have to be there, and now she's on a ventilator. And we were just like, why? Why is this, but we just continued. We just held each other in the hall and just prayed, Lord, only you know what's happening to her right now. Only you know. Have known her life since before it was even conceived. Only you know the prayers that we've prayed that other people have never even heard. You know all of that. We need you to do something because we can't do anything. And so the doctor came out and he got us with his intern, and they took us into this little room and closed the door, and he was very kind. He was very calm. The Lord knew we needed him that first bit because they switched doctors, but we kept him for a long time. And he said, well, Annie's not really followed our plans. And I said, no, obviously not. And he said, what was actually happening was her vocal cords were snapping shut on her trachea and stopping her breathing. So they could not force, because vocal cords are like a muscle, they could not force them open, even with a bag of air. And if they continued to try to force them open, they were going to collapse her trachea. And so they had put her on a ventilator to protect her from damage, from hurting her. And that's just a really hard thing. Like, you think, well, how is that a good thing? But when I walked in and saw her, he was like, see, she's stable, she's okay. And I was like, a ventilator's a good thing, right? And he was like, yeah. And there were times during that time that they would look at us like, are you a real person? Like, why are you not losing your mind? And things like that. And it was Jesus. We would tell them, it's Jesus. It's Jesus. It's a blessing that she doesn't have meningitis. And they're like, yeah, you're okay, right? You're not losing your mind, right? They didn't really get us. They couldn't really understand, like, why we were not, because they've seen everything. That's people's children. That's the tiniest of people's children. And they told us, most people are not like you. They do not act like you. They do not carry themselves like you. There are not times that we didn't fall apart and we weren't sad and just really shattered. But the Lord was just so present that even the doctors and nurses could feel his presence. And for that we are thankful. I know that sometimes people think, well, why does this happen to me? This is not fair. Well, I'm not any more deserving of having a healthy baby than anybody else. I live in a fallen, sinful world. And I'm not any more deserving than anybody else. Just because the majority of babies that are there from a certain demographic doesn't mean that I am not a sinner too, that I am not a product of a sinful world. And I have to continue to tell myself that. I deserve death. Annie deserves death. We all deserve death because we're all sinners. God saved her life because he has a greater purpose and a greater plan. And so they started at that point looking at her brain. And I said to the doctor when he said, we're going to have to start looking at her brain, that could have meant cancer. That could have meant a tumor. That could have meant when they looked inside, her head was full of blood. It could have meant really, really scary things. But what I saw in my mind was a puzzle, one of those 5 million piece puzzles that you throw in the air and it lands all over the place. And you think, how am I going to put this back together? All I could see is the pieces suddenly falling into place, that if they had not watched her breathing from the beginning, they might not have seen her stop breathing as quickly as they did, and started working on her to find. They had tested every other organ in her body. They had treated her for remote things that Rich and I were like, how can you even get that? I mean, we just didn't even know. Like, how does some of these things come about? And they were like, we don't think it's that, but we have to rule it out. And so it was like God was putting the pieces together. And I said to the doctors, this is what you needed to find all along. Would you ever have looked at her brain? And he said, probably not. That would not have been the first place I would have looked. And so they started looking at her brain. They did where they looked through the soft spot, and it was not full of blood. So then we told the doctors, we're going to start praying that it is the least possible problem. That it's something that is so easily fixable that only the Lord knew, and that he's already begun to heal, that it's not something that's going to give her long-term damage, or that's what we're going to pray. And they were like, that's what you need to pray. And so every time they were like, it's not this, that's a blessing, right? It's not this, that's a blessing. And so they determined that Annie had a small brain bleed. It could have happened before, like in utero. It could have happened during birth, labor, and delivery. It happens in 1 in 4 children, and you don't even know it. It would just reabsorb into the brain. It's not an abnormal thing to happen. But in Annie's case, it interrupted the synapses of her brain and caused a type of seizure that caused her vocal cords to stop her breathing. They don't think that if it ever happened again that it would happen in the same way. They think it's because she was so small and just in so much distress, basically. What it boils down to is that if Annie had not gone to the NICU on the second night, but especially on the 4th night, we would have woken up on the 5th morning and Annie would have been dead at the foot of our bed. I mean, I believe that with all my heart. So what looked like something terrible when I signed those papers was actually God rescuing her life. His no was actually a yes to his purpose. Not to mine, but to his. I mean, it would have worked out fabulously if it had gone on the way I had planned. But that's not what was best, and that's not what was right, and that's not a way for God's glory to be displayed in our lives. And I really wrestle with the Lord over those nights. Because, see, I've been a Christian since I was 5 years old. I know all the Sunday school stories. I can sing all the Sunday school songs. My mother was children's director. But that doesn't mean anything if it's not a real thing in your life, if he's not the God of all your days. That doesn't mean anything. Until you are the Israelites with the blood of the Lamb over the doorpost, wondering if it's going to be enough, it doesn't mean anything. God kept bringing the story of Abraham to my mind over and over again, where he says, I've given you this child and now I want you to sacrifice him to me because I want you to be obedient to me no matter what I say, because I can do anything. I can bring the dead to life. I can give you a baby when you're 100 years old. And God kept bringing that to mind over and over again and asking me. One night I remember I held my Bible. I slept with my Bible because I couldn't hold any of my children. My big kids were with my mom and dad. Annie was at the NICU. My whole world, what I do 24 hours a day, was gone. And so I held my Bible, and I remember wrestling with the Lord and him saying, if Annie's life brought one person to me by me taking it, there's a list of people I pray for to become Christians. If Annie's life brought one of those people to me, would it be worth it to you? Would you put her on the altar like Abraham did Isaac? And I would answer, of course I would. Of course, like Peter, of course I love you. Of course I do that. Over and over. But if Annie's life brought one person to the Lord, would you do it? Would you sacrifice her for me? Yes, of course I would. And finally I said, yes, I would do anything that you asked, because I want her to bring you glory. Whether it's here or in heaven, I want her to bring you glory, and I know that she'll do that either way. And he said, I don't need her life. I just need your obedience. I already sent my son. His life has rescued us from our sins. I don't need Annie's life. But I need you to be obedient to me, regardless of what it costs. Because all the Sunday school stories are great. But when you live it, when it's a real thing in your life, when you live through, and this was the most difficult, the hardest thing I've ever done in my whole entire life. Because anything in our life can become an idol. And people are number one thing because they're so important to us. She's a baby. She's little. Like, why does she have to go through this? Because we can do hard things. Because we can do hard things with Jesus. And so we just try to live our life for his glory. But when I was finally obedient, I knew that the Lord was not going to take her life. I didn't know what our life was going to look like or what we were going to have to do or the therapies that we might have to go through or what she would be like. But I knew that God was not going to take her life and that he was going to bless us because of our obedience. And so tonight is the last seizure medicine dose because she's been taking 2 seizure medicines. Tonight is the last dose for this girl right here. And it's still a walk of obedience because she could still have an episode for the rest of her life. I mean, she has a history of seizures. So she could still, there are things she can't do. There are medications she can't take. This is still, and there were times I would give her the medicine. She would spit it up. I would be on the floor crying. Rich would walk in and be like, babe. And I'm like, I can't get her to take them. I can't. And he's like, even though you feel like you can control this, and the Lord's the same way, even though you feel like you can control this, you can't control anything. I'm still in control. I was in control the night she almost died. I'm in control right now. But that doesn't always mean happy things. That doesn't always mean squishy things. That doesn't always mean rainbows. That means he is the God of all your days. He is the God of your really hard days, and he is the God of your really good days because the blood of the Lamb is enough. And if he had taken her, it would still have had to be enough. But he didn't. So tonight is our last seizure medication. We went to our NICU clinics and they said, she's perfect. We see kids every 6 months. She never has to come back. There's nothing wrong with her. She's top of the charts for height and weight. There's nothing wrong with her. We haven't had an MRI, but like the structure of her skull, there's nothing wrong. And I tell them it's because when my God heals, he heals abundantly because it's just what he does. So we are praising him for her life. Annie's name means prayer. It comes from Hannah, the name Hannah. Hannah prayed for Samuel for all those years. And so her sister prayed for her. I prayed for her. So her name is Annie, which means prayer. And her middle name is Lee, which is after my mom. But Lee in American means healer. And we picked that a long time ago. But we've gotten to see an abundant healer. And we are so, so thankful for that, aren't we? Yeah. So just pray for us to continue to be obedient to him and for Annie to be obedient to him as she shares her story. And hopefully her story was encouraging to you. I know it's been encouraging to us because like Job said before when they asked him, would you have gone through all this? Was it all worth it? After everything you lost, after all the stress and the, just being physically ill, was it worth it? And Job said, yes, it was worth it because before I only heard what God could do. But now I've seen it with my own eyes. And so that is Annie's story. Before we heard about it. But now we've seen it. And now you guys have seen it too. Thank you.